What is the next two or three things that you think the Foreign Office should be doing from India?
But I think even a limited contribution by India to the peace process would be helpful. To some extent, I think the intent has already been signaled, Indian intent. Continuing conflict between Russia and the West is not in India's interest.
So in this week's Rajamandala, in your column, you've looked at an interesting thing of Europe and India, but also in the context of what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. And there's been sort of, I think there's an interesting phrase you use. There's been a sort of, let's call it strategic neglect. That is, while we
Yeah.
have, of course, Europe has been part of India's consciousness, Britain in particular. I mean, we were both colonized and continue to speak the language, the people-to-people contact. Why why do you think both sides have had this sort of in the last say 20, 30 years, broadly not looking at each other in geopolitical terms?
Yeah. I think the answer is fairly simple. I mean, I think Europe, after the end of the Cold War, was focused on integration. That means making a European Union out of sovereign states. So the entire energy went into integration. And they felt there was no threat. They didn't have to worry about anything. The Americans were largely taking care of security. Post-Soviet Russia was largely friendly, though they had problems. There was no threat from Russia. And they had a huge market in China. So I think the focus on economics, commerce, meant that they thought there was no real threat. So for them, then geopolitics became secondary. And for India, I think India's preoccupation was dealing with China, Pakistan, the US, rather than with Europe, though Europe was a big trading partner. India did deal with them in Brussels. But I think India, too, I mean, did not think of Europe in geopolitical terms. I think the Ukraine war has changed all that. Europe now faces really hard geopolitical dilemmas, is trying to reset itself. And India also is affected by what's happened in Ukraine. And that for now, until recently, our focus was entirely on Asia, on the Indo-Pacific. But I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Sino-Russian alliance, and the economic consequences of the Ukraine war have all woken up India to think of Europe and conflict in Europe in fresh terms.
You spoke of the Ukraine conflict, of course, is the big factor here. Europe had also been, so we keep talking now about balancing acts. So we always focus on India's thing. So between Russia, China on the one hand, Russia, US on the other, and even China, US, and China, Europe to an extent. What are the kinds of choices now Europe is having to make? Even now, there was energy in Russia, there's China, huge trade relationship. So, what are the choices that Europe is now stuck making? What are
Yeah.
their dilemmas there?
Yeah, I think they're largely written off Russia as a threat. Germany, in particular, had a deepening economic relationship with Russia. They thought trade and economic cooperation was going to bring Russia as part of Europe. But I think Russia had serious problems in terms of how NATO has expanded. And the Russians saw whatever understanding they had at the end of the Soviet Union. Those understandings were not respected. So therefore, they're into a revisionist mode, if you will. They want to take a fresh look at European security. And they're willing to play a high stakes game. The fact that they're using military force in Ukraine, they talk about use of nuclear weapons. And I think they're basically saying, look, you got to listen to us. You got to give us a better deal. So I think the Russia question then, Europe doesn't know how to deal with this problem because on the one hand, you think Europe's economy is at least 7, 8 times bigger than Russia's. Russia is around $2.5 trillion, while Europe is around almost $20 trillion. So it's a large economy, much bigger than Russia,
Yeah.
but it had largely outsourced its defense function to the United States. So now the problem is that now the Americans are saying, look after yourself.
Yeah.
But Europe is not ready. It's kind of largely allowed its defense industry to wither away. Its armies are shrinking. So therefore, for them, then the whole problem of how do they defend themselves on their own without proper American support is a big question. Then the third thing is really they thought China was going to be their friend because China became a big market for them.
Yeah.
But now China has become close to Russia and is accused of supporting Russia in the war. So they don't know whether they should criticize China for support to Russia, or to depend on China for getting the Russians out of Ukraine. So the American question, the Russian question, the China question, all have sharpened for them. And then meanwhile, Europe's own internal divisions have sharpened. Hungary goes its own way. Not everybody's agreed in Europe of how to deal with the three big questions: the Russian question, the Chinese question, and the American question.
Right. So, everyone read the piece. It's on the indianexpress.com, and there should be a link in the description of this video wherever you're watching. So now back to India. There's now, I think it's not yet fully confirmed, but it's very likely that Prime Minister Modi is going to be visiting Ukraine. And I think soon after then, there's some sense that, and then there was the Quad meeting in which India signed the joint statement, basically saying territorial aggression, integrity, the diplomatic language which is seen to be condemning Russia, or at least stern about Russia. You make the case that India should be now more involved in the peace process. It has economic interest in this war ending and ending peacefully. It has strategic interest. I mean, you're still somewhat dependent on Russia. At least Russian arms are no small part of our broader defense procurement basket. What is the next two or three things that you think the Foreign Office should be doing from India? Should be
Yeah.
the short term, medium term kind of goals in this
Yeah.
regard?
No, I think in the short term, I mean, the question of look, there are a lot of talk about promoting a peace process. Though some people think Russia and Ukraine might be tired, but they're not exhausted. So therefore, they're not really ready for the peace process, and that actually they would all want to wait till see who gets elected in the United States. But irrespective of where the waiting game is, for India, I think as a large economy, as a major power, as a rising nation, I think it should actually do what it can to bring peace to the region.
Yeah.
Though some people would say, look, India is not the main player, so therefore you should not overestimate your capacity. But I think even a limited contribution by India to the peace process would be helpful. To some extent, I think the intent has already been signaled, Indian intent. Prime Minister Modi, when he went to Moscow, he talked about you can't solve these kind of problems on the battlefield. Just before at the G7 summit, when its first trip to Italy after being elected the third time, he met Zelensky in Italy on the margins of the G7 summit. So I think they're beginning to put together an effort to engage both sides. And the visit will be Russia visit followed by Ukraine visit would be the kind of follow-up. So I think they seem to be a desire to play a role for peace. But I would say even whether we are successful or not, my sense is at least two important consequences. One, I think for India, a continuing conflict between Russia and the West is not in India's interest because the big beneficiary of the Russia-West conflict has always been China.
Yeah.
And even in the present context, we see how China is benefiting from this conflict. So therefore, for India, I think to reduce the conflict between US and the US, Europe on one hand, and Russia on the other is in its own interest. Second, I think is this attempt to promote peace it should not be seen as a one-shot affair, but actually as the beginning of a process in which India reconnects with European security issues. I think we've largely forgotten India's historic role with European geopolitics, whether during the colonial era, during for example, Imperial Germany supported a provisional government of India. We had Indian troops fought bravely in the First and Second World Wars. So in many ways, our history is tied to the European geopolitics. But I think over the decades, I think certainly after the end of the Cold War, we began to see this region as somewhat distant. We don't really have to engage with this region. But now I think the Ukraine war has created the need for engaging with European geopolitics. And I think that will be in India's long-term interest as well.
Thank you so much, sir. Everyone, read the piece. It's on the indianexpress.com, and we'll see you soon. So thank you so much.